Welcome back to Pet Squares, where today we are talking about the Beach Boys Christmas album, in the land where Christmas is always happening, the Philippines. Diba?
Yes.
Right, okay. And welcome back everyone for the latest episode of Pet Squares, where we're going to be covering the Beach Boys' 7th album, the Beach Boys Christmas album. And apologies for my somewhat drab surroundings. We are doing this Christmas episode in the middle of May in the Philippines in a very small little condo. If you've ever been to the Philippines, they're really big on Christmas in this country, so that is one kind of appropriate thing if you have to do this show in the middle of May. Anywhere in the world, the Philippines might as well be it. Before we get into the show, I just want to let everybody know that we're about to start a new Patron Drive for the channel. Fundraising on YouTube is about as popular as a case of herpes, and I apologize for that. I've really tried to keep that in the background, but we are reaching a point where the time that I have to put into these shows is going to start to compete with the time I'm going to need to spend making a living. If you are not in a position to support the channel, I totally understand. Please keep watching anyway. But if you are and you want to see these shows happen more often, please consider becoming a patron of this channel. The information will be below in the comment box. In the meantime, you know, we're sort of stuck with this. And by the way, this is indeed me. This is the same guy. I've had a bit of a transformation. Physically, not a bad one I'm pretty happy with. But this is what you're going to be looking at for the time being. Okay, so let's start right in. We're looking at the Beach Boys Christmas album. There's the cover right there. It was released November 9th, 1964. It made it to number 6 on the Billboard Holiday Chart. It was recorded, however, the second half of June 1964, less than a month after All Summer Long, the Beach Boys' finest record up to that point. This album coming so soon after All Summer Long, his original songs on this album show a noticeable lack of ambition. We're going to get into that as we talk about it. But what was cool about this album, no doubt for Brian, was that for more than half of it, he was assisted by Dick Reynolds. Dick Reynolds was an arranger who had worked on the Four Freshmen album, the Four Freshmen being a band that Brian idolized, harmonically a blueprint for the Beach Boys' four-part harmony jazz-inflected style. So Dick Reynolds was on board both to conduct a 41-piece orchestra and to arrange the band's harmonies, which amazingly the band cut several of the songs live in the studio with the orchestra. That's right, they did it old school. They sang while the orchestra was playing. Even in a couple of places they did retakes along with the orchestra. Pretty impressive feat. Then they would go back to their more familiar surroundings of Western recorders. By the way, the bulk of this album was either cut at Capitol or United. Brian later remembered the sessions having been done at Western, but it appears that the vocals and the band stuff was done at Western, not necessarily the orchestral stuff. But at any rate, the band would cut its vocals live with the orchestra, amazingly, and then go back and do some fixes and double track their vocals in the studio. And a couple of the songs were, the vocals were completely done as overdubs, but for quite a number of these tracks, the Beach Boys were singing live in the studio with the orchestra. Pretty amazing to contemplate that. So the band was in its usual lineup at this point of Brian, Carl, Dennis, Mike, and Al, although Dennis was apparently replaced vocally on a number of these tracks, but probably by Bob Norberg, Brian's longtime friend and sometime collaborator. Also a little bit of mix and match on the bass chair. Al Jardine played on some of the band tracks. Brian played on one. We'll get into that. And apparently Ray Pohlman from the Wrecking Crew seems to have played on at least one track. I have to say, listening to this album, I think it's a considerably weaker effort in a lot of ways than the records that had come before it. Now, we live in a time where you're not supposed to criticize anything or anybody, or there will be immediately some blowback. So let me assure you, you know, if you find pleasure in this album, that's a wonderful thing. It was certainly designed for a wider audience than the Beach Boys albums up to that time. And I'm sure the marketing executives at Capitol fully saw the potential of a Beach Boys album in the holiday market. But it must also have been an inspiration to Brian when Phil Spector came out with his ill-fated Christmas album, A Christmas Gift for You, featuring his entire stable of artists. It unfortunately, despite being an acknowledged masterpiece of Spector's production style, came out the same day as the assassination of President John F. Kennedy, sealing its doom, but it's since become a very revered holiday classic. Brian must have both wanted to emulate once again his idol Phil Spector, and must have been absolutely thrilled to have the arranger for his idols, the Four Freshmen, on board for this project. He must have also been thrilled because he was getting increasingly overworked at this time. The band was about to embark on an endless tour, hence its recording in June, immediately after the All Summer Long album. And there's no question Brian needed and valued the help. This album was re-released several times, and most significantly in 1998, it was coupled with a second unreleased attempt at Beach Boys Christmas album that was mostly recorded. When I say mostly recorded, it was entirely recorded in 1977, but it was mostly recorded in terms of having all the parts finished on it. It just was rejected by the record company for reasonably solid reasons, I think, and reworked into the MIU album, which came out in 1978. But we're not going to be talking about the 1977-78 tracks on this show. We'll probably get to them at this rate sometime in the 23rd century. But anyway, let's start in right now with the task at hand, talking about the Beach Boys Christmas album as released in November 1964. Okay, first up we've got Little Saint Nick. This had been a holiday single for the band the previous year, 1963. Had done extremely well, making it to number 3 on the holiday chart. It is one of the perennial classics in the Christmas rock and roll genre, despite being a complete, blatant, and honestly presented ripoff of their prior hit, Little Deuce Coupe. It's in the same key, A flat, has the same shuffle beat, although it has considerably more going on in terms of its chord progression. It adds quite a lot in terms of the progressions at hand. Here's my guitar, tangled up. It's always tangled up. Well, I'm not bragging, babe, so don't put me down. So Brian basically changes it into a minor. Kind of implies that kind of switch back and forth, which is somewhat similar to Little Deuce Coupe. So he's just switching that around, right? But to cover that up, he does this really cool leading tone thing. Way out west where the air gets cold. Then very cool way he goes to the 4 chord and does a descending thing. But it's still basically the Little Deuce Coupe progression, which is Little Deuce Coupe. You don't know. It's basically the same progression turned on its head. So very clever. Even the conceit of the lyric, it's the Little Saint Nick, kind of a reach there. A Little Saint Nick, very peculiar name for a hot rod or a hot rodded up toboggan, which is what they are referring to in this song. David Marks plays guitar on this song. It was apparently his last session with the band. It took place on October 20th, 1963, according to Andrew Doe's excellent Bellagio10452.com website, which means that David Marks, because of his likely appearance on Don't Worry Baby on All Summer Long, was on every Beach Boys album up through the end of 1964, so even though he was gone from the band the previous year. There's also an overdub that was on the single version with Murray and Brian kind of answering each other on the glockenspiel, and the Celeste and Carl and Al shaking sleigh bells. It's kind of cool to think about Brian playing a little glockenspiel melody and Murray back there answering him on the Celeste. The album version stripped that last overdub off to sort of match the more rough-hewn nature of the other songs. So we've got basically a different mix, a different iteration, if you will, of Little Deuce Coupe here. Very cool, sharp vocal blend here. Carl, unusually loud in the vocal blend. He tended up to this point to get a little buried, and Dennis would be the one that would be loud, but we got a lot of Carl here, much to the benefit of this song. Brian wrote it apparently without access to an instrument. He was driving apparently to or from a date, came up with the idea for the lyrics, got home and fleshed out the arrangement in his head on the piano. Mike Love was later retrospectively awarded credit for the lyrics on this song and several others on this album. It must be said that the lyrics, which kind of veer from kind of weird to very clever, do sound a bit in Mike's wheelhouse. I mean, we are talking about a song about a sled that's a hot rod called A Little Saint Nick, which is, yeah, a stretch. Basically, it's like, hey guys, we're rewriting Little New Scoop, but it's a holiday song. They're really blatant about it with this whole deal. But, you know, the casualness and the kind of attitude with it, the whole thing about the Rudy the lead, Rudolph the Red-Nosed Reindeer, pretty slick. Kind of a cool lyric. So whether it was Brian's or Mike's, very likely both of them, an interesting, how do we say this? Rip themselves off. I'm just going to put it that way. Not for the last time in this album. In fact, we'll be talking about that very, very soon. But despite appropriating the Little Deuce Coupe groove, what a great groove it is. They've really got that locked in. Dunk-a-dunk-a-dunk-a-dunk-a-dunk-a-dunk. Brian Wilson redid it. One of two songs he redid on his What I Really Want for Christmas album in 2005. And that is pretty much all I have to say about Little Saint Nick. Next up, we've got The Man with All the Toys. This was the new single to be released with the album, going to number 6 on the holiday chart. This, despite not being nearly as well known as Little Saint Nick, is still on Rolling Stone's list of the top 100 best-selling Christmas songs of all time. Was it Rolling Stone? Somebody made a list. It was on it. What can I say? This, unlike Little Saint Nick, was kind of an original vibe for them. You've got this sort of stop and start melody, da da da, da da da, da da da, and all these little up unison things here, no harmony there. That all sounds kind of Herb Alperty, kind of backracky. The rhythm track is pretty nice, the way it really hammers down the quarter notes there. That's sort of a Wilson Brothers trademark. Really nice meat and potatoes. Da, 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 da. I have to wonder if that wasn't some Beatles influence starting to creep into how they were approaching these tracks. But it's a really satisfying track, and Brian once again redid it in 2005 for his Christmas album. They expanded on it a little bit with a new bridge and a refrain that quotes Joy to the World. And the 2005 version with Brian's band, quite enjoyable. I would even argue maybe even a little bit better than the Beach Boys version. They're both really great. And the Brian Wilson version rocks a little harder, got a little more aggressive drums to it. But I really like this song. This is sort of a sleeper track for me in that, you know, I'd never really got on my own radar as a fan until I was reviewing it for this show. And this is a really cool little song. It even has a little weird kind of breakdown, which if you listen to the instrumental tracks without the vocals where it goes, it's the man with all the toys, you'll notice it's a little bit Smile-like because he kind of breaks everything down. Kind of stops, the tempo changes, and then it goes back to this other thing. It's got a sort of a fragmented feel. You've got that da 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 da, and then you suddenly got to go boom. It's the man with all the toys. Anticipating Smile a little bit. That sort of fragmentary approach, and where things just suddenly stop. I really like the simplicity of it. I like the sort of the different sort of kind of very rhythmic but spare sound of the track, less cluttered with vocals, except where it comes in with the B section, of course, where Brian starts singing the lead. It gets thicker there. Also, Carl's solo, very simplistic for him, single note stuff. Really nice, really effective, and with that solo, it almost anticipates indie pop a little bit. It's just a really neat little track. Sort of mono-fatness of it anticipates what we're about to hear with the Beach Boys today, where they get into kind of a thicker sound. It's a really cool experiment, and it works, but it's really short. You can see why they expanded it for Brian's album. And it does, again, speak to the sort of lack of ambition on this album. Brian later in an interview said he wrote it in just an hour. And it does sound like they just, okay, now we're done with the song, we're moving on. And even though Beach Boys songs at the time were quite short, it sounds like they had two ideas, they executed them, now they were done, boom, on to the next thing. Mike got a retroactive writing credit on this one, as he did on the previous one. It also was covered by a Frenchman named René Martel in 1968 as Avez-vous le Père Noël? Have you seen Father Christmas? And I'm sure that I'm sure somebody thought they did, it being the 60s, and I don't know where I'm going with this thought. Okay, now we got Santa's Beard, where the Beach Boys ripping themselves off, because once again, we are back in the key of A flat, and Brian's playing games with the raised chord thing that he did on I'm getting them all mixed up now. Little Saint Nick. So you remember we were in A flat major on Little Deuce Coupe. I'm not bragging, babes, don't put me down. Little Deuce Coupe. And we turned that on its head for Little Saint Nick, which we covered up by the raising note singing. Okay, so for Santa's Beard, now we're back in A flat. Little Santa, really Santa, little Santa. So we're doing the raising thing. Same progression as Little Deuce Coupe, Little Deuce Coupe, Little Deuce Coupe. You don't know what I got. So basically, Brian's basically running the same play once again. He's doing the A flat thing. He's using leading voicings is what we call them, as he did in the previous two. There's a lot of evidence Brian was bringing his A game to the original songs on this album. Sorry if you love them, but this is just the conclusion I reach when I listen to this and work out what's going on here. Santa's Beard has an interesting conceit. Teenage boys bringing his little brother to see Santa, and the brother is distraught because the beard comes off, something like that. And it's kind of an interesting idea for a lyric because they've got to think of ways to make this Christmas concept sort of mesh with their teenage audience. And I like that idea. Well, teenagers, they got to bring their baby brother to see Santa. And, pretty clever way to square this circle for them. It has some really cool fat harmonies. Once again, there's a nice harmonic blend on this album. There's some really good stuff. Dennis definitely sings on this. There's some question about how much he's singing on the rest of the album, but he is apparently on this track in the background. And again, it's kind of a slight song. When we get to the fade out, nothing new happens. He's just killing Santa Claus. I don't know what he says. And then what do we do for the fade out? Same thing. It's Santa, really, really Santa, lop bop Santa, and you love the bass line. Anyway, so it's just basically going down the scale. So not much to the song compositionally, and it is definitely sprung from the same cloth as Little Saint Nick and Little Deuce Coupe. Next up, Merry Christmas Baby, and I'm going to say something controversial. This song sucks. Okay, that's a little strong, but when you sit down and work the song out, and it's going to be a little hard for me to show you what I mean by this because the song's so forgettable. I can't even keep it in my head long enough to explain why I think this song is pretty weak. But first of all, Merry Christmas Baby, not really a fantastically original title. I didn't do the research to see if the other song Merry Christmas Baby came out before this, but I think it was. Regardless, Brian doesn't do very much with this title. He just says Merry Christmas Baby, Merry Christmas Baby, stuck for a new idea, modulates up a whole step, and then back to the verse. It's about the laziest possible thing he could have done in terms of doing a chorus for this song. For Brian, who had ADD in the best possible way when he was writing, this is just phoning it in for Brian. The verse at least has kind of a cool melody. The intro's nice. The groove is nice. Mike does a pretty good job selling. There's not much to sell with this song. Apparently, Ray Pullman on bass for this. Even he's a bit sloppy in spots. There's some weird stuff going on in some places. But the really interesting thing about this song, to me, is the intro, which has the bass guitar playing off the piano. If the vocals are stripped away, it really sounds a lot like Do You Like Worms from Smile. It's got that very sort of similar bass and piano loping on a single chord thing, and that is really interesting. Brian's, again, sort of in very subtle ways starting to move us toward the Smile deal. But despite a kind of a nice groove and decent melody, The chorus is lazy. The band's vocals, stuff they could do in their sleep. Boning it in, Brian, compositionally. If you love the song, more power to you. I can barely even remember it to criticize it. But again, he had just made All Summer Long. Brian just wanted to get his half of the album done with so he could get in the studio with Dick Reynolds and make some magic. Okay, next is Christmas Day. This one really stands out from the other of the original tracks on this album. It was very curious, and I actually asked Craig Sawinski and his team, the people that consult on this show, and I want to give shouts out to them for their kind words about the show and the great research that gets forwarded to me and that I occasionally get to dig into and put my own spin on. This was one where I sort of questioned whether, because I was told that it was Brian playing bass on this, and I thought it sounded unusually aggro and high up the neck, and also sounded like it was being played with a pick. It really didn't sound like Brian at all. The guitar playing didn't sound like Carl, and given that the intro quotes Chuck Berry's School Days rather as Al did on California Calling on the 1985 album, and it's very sort of strummy and triplety, very un-Carl. I had wondered if it was Al Jardine on guitar, which he usually wasn't on these classic records, particularly in the lead position as the guitar player. And this is, as we'll get into in a minute, Al Jardine's first official lead vocal on a Beach Boys album. So I thought, well, maybe it's Al on guitar and something else is going on here. So I asked to hear the tapes, and it is actually, as advertised, it's Dennis on drums, Carl on two guitars, one played with the track, one overdubbed, which gives it that kind of wide stereo, again, almost indie rock kind of sound. It doesn't sound like the Beach Boys. It's strummy, it's slightly detuned, so it almost sounds more like an early 80s college rock record. And Brian's aggro playing is explained by the fact that he is playing with a pick. He says at one point on the session tapes to Chuck Britz, "I love playing with a pick, it's so easy." He, as most of you know, he usually played with his thumb. Sometimes if he needed to articulate, he would play with the nail on the edge of his thumb. But on this track, and apparently on one or two other isolated instances in his career, he played with a pick, and he apparently had no problem with it. And you can hear him on the session tapes experimenting with it, having an old blast, and that explains why it's sort of an atypical sounding track. And the other thing that is an issue, probably making this track both a lot looser, because Carl, Dennis, none of the guys are really locking in on this track real good. John Brode, who's one of the people that's done heavy research and listening on this, suggested, and actually I had the same thought, that a lot of it had to do with the rhythm of this song, because they're basically not doing a typical Beach Boys rhythm. They're doing these sort of 6/8 triplets. Not really seemingly in Carl's comfort zone, and maybe why they didn't have Al play on it. They may have felt that it wasn't something that he could hack on the bass, or it could also be that Al was absent from part of these sessions, given that he didn't play bass on the prior track. But be that as it may, Christmas Day, very interesting song sonically for those reasons. No keyboards except for Brian's overdubbed organ solo, which in itself has kind of an unusual skating rink kind of a vibe, a little more like what we would imagine would be on a Murray Wilson record than a Brian Wilson record. Again, as John Brode has pointed out, it sounds a little bit more like a Murray song than a Brian song. In fact, the skating rink organ, I had to quote this, so struck a commenter on YouTube that he says, and I quote, "Ha ha 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 ha, the organ at 9:08, so funny. I'm not stoned now, but when I'm stoned, I can hear such a funny tone at the organ, ha ha ha. And made a smoking break at the 17/11/207 until the 11 December 2017, but I'm not smoking every day." Quote from YouTube on the organ solo on this. I couldn't have said it better myself. But this song is very significant for one other reason. It's Al Jardine's first official lead vocal on a Beach Boys album. He did, as we discussed, have sort of an accidental lead vocal bit before he was even an official member of the band on a prior track called No Go Showboat. But this is the first credited lead vocal where he's singing all the way through. And I was going to talk a bit about how much he sounded like Brian, and talk about how much the reverb that they used was responsible for what we perceive as the Beach Boys sound. But it turns out, on closer examination to the session tapes, that Brian actually sang the first pass of this song, and then Al Jardine overdubbed 2 more vocals on top of it. So it actually is a Brian performance buried underneath Al's performance. But it's also significant because it's a very atypical vocal performance for Al. Al hadn't really nailed down what he was going to be like as a vocalist, as a lead vocalist yet. So he's basically aping Brian's vocal delivery, where he kind of crosses over to the falsetto, and you hear that Al isn't really strong on his crossover notes the way the Wilson brothers were. What I mean by that is when you're singing and you're navigating between your normal voice and what we call the head voice, or some people call it the falsetto. There's actually a couple of different ways of reaching the higher tones, but there's a break that you have to negotiate where da 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 da. Here I kind of went. So going in and out of that's one of the trickiest things you could do as a singer, and the Wilson brothers were really good at that. But when Al sang, he mostly either sang falsetto or he sang full voice, and he would sing real loud full voice, like up there, whereas Carl or Brian might have gone, kind of doing a different thing there. And now Al probably did a lot more crossing over in the backing vocals, where you can hide that sort of break in the voice. But here, where Al's mimicking Brian's vocal delivery, and he's going from the full voice into falsetto, you can hear how much quieter and a little bit weaker his falsetto sounds relative to his main voice. And that's no disrespect to Al as a vocalist, because it's not really in his wheelhouse. Al was much more of just, as I said, he would spike that note up in the higher register rather than singing in falsetto. It's one of the key reasons why the Beach Boys vocals got so strong and driving once Al got into the band. But Al did have a little bit of a tricky thing going straight, doing a midline thing from going from full voice to falsetto. You can hear this on the In Concert album in 1973, where he's singing Don't Worry Baby, and he has a little bit of trouble on the verses doing Brian's vocal thing. Start to brag about my car. That's really difficult to do, and for most people, you'll go, start to brag about, while you're going into the other voice. And Al did have a little trouble with this aspect of his voice, and this song really forces him to sing that way. I think it's a really cool vocal. I like hearing his sort of slightly rougher and less forceful take on Brian's melody. It's really kind of a cool sonic experiment for Al to do, but as I said, not really in his wheelhouse. But I do like the song a lot, including that aspect of it. It's got a really interesting melody. Da, 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 da. Very acrobatic melody to ask Al to do on his very first lead vocal. But getting back to what I was talking about, maybe Brian not taking these songs real seriously, if you listen to the session tapes on this, as I did, as I said, on a couple other things too, but basically I really drilled down into this. Not only are they having trouble with this song, but Brian didn't really want to spend that much time on it. He laughs at one point and says 23 takes on a piece of and at another point he says to Dennis, don't play roles, Dennis. This isn't a big production, play it cool. So clearly Brian himself didn't think much of this song. It was just something he dashed off for the album. And I would argue, other than The Man with All the Toys, this is probably the best of the original newly written Christmas songs for this album. So for all you folks thinking I'm dissing on Brian for his sort of lackluster songwriting efforts on this album, Brian felt the same way at the time. He was just trying to get these tracks banged out. It is a little bit like the Little Deuce Coupe album, which they did, as I said, on the shows covering that album in possibly short period of time. This album, they had longer to work on, but it sounds like they were even more rushed in the sessions and had even less time to live with and develop the songs. And I think they were just trying to get some Christmas songs done. And bam, suddenly we're in the orchestral part of the album. Dick Reynolds comes in strong, and right away we see that he is going to arrange the bejesus out of these songs. The 41-piece orchestra, I'm not going to list all the players on this. You can see them on Wikipedia if you're interested in who they were. They're given lots to do. The best way I could describe Reynolds' arrangements is florid. They're very elaborated. Some might say over elaborated. It's just, he just went for it. And how you feel about him kind of depends on on how you feel about that kind of very blowsy, very big orchestrated sound where you're just trying to find things for every instrument to do. For me, it's a little hit and miss. I'm going to talk about where I think it hits and where it misses. But again, that's my personal opinion. There are going to be some people that love this kind of thing and some people that don't. The one thing I will say about this record that I think holds pretty true is the orchestral tracks overall sound pretty muddy. The vocals don't quite have the same level of clarity that we've come to expect on Beach Boys records. The orchestra isn't as well defined as I would like. I would love to hear an audiophile reissue of this, because if you go back and listen to the raw tracks that were bootleg, you got just much sharper clarity with the orchestra. Now you're really starting to feel a real vividness to the sound. And if you assume these were done at Capitol, and you think about the kind of things Frank Sinatra was doing with Nelson Riddle and how really present and great those records sound, despite how long ago they were done, you have the same recording technology at work capturing Dick Reynolds' arrangements. And it's a shame that with the finished product, I think partly because of the Beach Boys overdubbing on top of it and also cutting live with the band, they lost some clarity with the mastering of the orchestra, dubbing it down to mono, and some clarity with the vocals maybe being some of them being done with the orchestra and stuff. Now, I am going off of what's on YouTube. I don't know if this was remastered later for the 1998 reissue. It's possible this stuff was cleaned up at that time. If it was, then I apologize for my ignorance, but that's just my impression listening off of YouTube. Okay, so we got Frosty the Snowman. My first reaction is this is really kind of cool. It reminds me of watching cartoons when I was a kid, and of course Frosty the Snowman, which there was a cartoon version of that made a few years after this recording was made, and that was a perennial thing when we were kids growing up in the 70s, probably still is now. Dick Reynolds was ready to roll, and I want to also emphasize he also did the vocal arrangements, which makes sense because he was the guy behind what the Four Freshmen did, and I'm sure Brian was thrilled to get stuff from what he considered to be a master of vocal arrangement. The Beach Boys were more than up to the task. It's very, again, impressive that they took on some pretty complicated stuff and did some of it live with the orchestra. Brian's on lead here. I believe the second moving harmony under him is Mike, although the fact that it's a little hard to tell in spots just goes to show you how long Mike and Brian had been singing together. They had done Everly Brothers two-part harmonies since they were in their mid-teens, and this is one area of Mike's vocal abilities that's a little bit underrated, because Mike has a very distinctive style that we all know and love, but here he matches Brian's tonality very closely, and they sound wonderful together in two parts, assuming it's him, and I do think it is. Speaking of Mike, his climbing bass vocal at various points in the song, hella cool. History of the song: it was written by Walter Rollins and Steve Nelson, first recorded by Gene Autry in 1950 as a purpose-built follow-up to Rudolph the Red-Nosed Reindeer, which had been a smash hit for him the prior year. It has been covered tons of times, with Jimmy Durante, Nat King Cole, and Jan and Dean being the most prominent ones prior to this recording. The Jan and Dean recording of Frosty the Snowman is hilarious, as much of this stuff is. I highly recommend seeking it out. It's probably my favorite version of this song. But this one's no slouch. If a recording can be a slouch, I don't know. Maybe slouch isn't the right word, but it doesn't slouch. And now we're into We Three Kings of Orient are. And this is another Brian and Mike led one, another one where you can really hear Mike doing a great job matching Brian's tonality. Mike had a lovely tone when he chose to sing softly. You hear it on the Kokomo hit from 1988. I will say that Mike probably didn't sing this way as often as he might have, because he did seem to have some trouble maintaining his pitch when he would sing with this sort of softer, rounder tone. Even though his performance on this with Brian is lovely, there are some pitchy spots of Mike's sort of sprinkled throughout this take. And again, they were cutting live with the orchestra, so we got to cut them a little slack for that. So there are a few flaws in the vocal performance, but overall lovely tonality from Mike. A very unironically somber intro that when Brian and Mike were waiting for the cue, apparently Brian kept coming in the wrong place, and Mike said on the session tapes, Brian keeps blowing it. So that you can imagine Brian and Mike just sitting there, sing live with the orchestra, Brian coming in wrong and not knowing where he was coming in, and Mike kind of egging him on, and the orchestra just, planning their European vacations as the session time rolled up. The mournful B section on this is really, really lovely. But my goodness, the trumpets at the end are screaming. When they get to the a cappella ending, it's quite daring with it voiced as low as it is and as dissonant as it is. Every little bit of pitchiness is just going to make it sound like a train wreck. But they, despite, as I said, there's a couple of pitchy spots in other parts of the song. They nail the ending. There's very little room for error in that ending part, and they really pull it off quite well. The history of this song: it was written by an Episcopal rector in Williamsport, Pennsylvania, in 1857, and as many of my family are Episcopal priests on the East Coast, I feel a personal connection to that, I guess, or through them. This was the first American-penned Christmas carol to become widely accepted as part of the Christmas songbook. The name of said rector is not written down by me on my notes. Let's just get his name right. I got the computer right here. What's the guy's name? We three kings, we little kings that adore you. Go ahead now, write a Christmas carol now. John Henry Hopkins Jr. in the house. John Henry Hopkins, the man. Another quote from Wikipedia I found very amusing. Quote, since the 1950s, the carol has been frequently parodied by children. The subject of the lyrics vary widely, depending on the region, with references to smoking explosive rubber cigars, selling counterfeit lingerie, or I don't know why I find this so hilarious, or traveling to an Irish bar by taxi, car, and scooter. Alrighty then. We didn't get any of that in the Beach Boys version, sad to say. Okay, next we got Blue Christmas. And once again, Dick Reynolds not holding back, is he? A pretty aggressive arrangement. Parts in the middle where I'm thinking, let's go watch an Audrey Hepburn film. But, again, how you feel about it depends on how you feel about that kind of thing. This is unusual in that it's a single-tracked Brian lead vocal. We don't get too many of those during this period. A kind of a raw Brian vocal. He's got that little choke in his voice that really worked for him in terms of conveying emotion. The first verse is a little pitchy around the edges, but from there on out, it's a magnificent vocal performance by Brian. No vocals by the band. Again, one less thing for them to do, I would imagine, as they're trying to bang this album out. The outro, quite portentous for such a I don't know. Blue Christmas, not really known for its portentousness, I guess. Blue Christmas, the history of the song, written by Billy Hayes and J.W. Johnson. First recorded by Doy Odell in 1948. The biggest hit up to that time was by Ernest Tubb in 1950. Elvis Presley had what a lot of people consider to be the definitive version. That hit in 1957. And an interesting thing about that, which Wikipedia pointed out to me, and I hadn't really thought about, is the vocal arrangement of Blue Christmas and Elvis Presley's version actually incorporated blue notes. In other words, notes that fell between the cracks of pitch. That's what we call blue notes. They're not quite in the minor third. They're not quite in the major third. They kind of creep up to the minor third. What Daryl Dragon was called the bent third. That's a cornerstone of blues and jazz. Its incorporation into popular music was somewhat revolutionary and controversial in the 50s. So Elvis and the Jordanaires, who I think did the vocals on that, his regular vocal backing group, incorporating blue notes into Blue Christmas kind of as a musical wink and a nod, and also a down with the street thing to blues and jazz tradition there. Kind of significant. I don't think Brian's version of Blue Christmas is going to make anyone forget Elvis's, but it's very, very respectable in its own right. Certainly not something that suffers greatly by comparison. It's Brian doing a very heartfelt and exposed emotionally version of the song, and it's lovely. Santa Claus is Coming to Town, a song that is possibly the best known track from the Christmas Gift to You, Phil Spector album of the prior year, Brian doing his own take on it with Dick Reynolds' invaluable help. Dick coming up with a demented orchestral arrangement for this song. It's just, he's Doc Severinsen at one point, then there's a carnival happening. Pop Goes the Weasel makes an appearance. So Dick Reynolds basically throwing the kitchen sink at it, perhaps in an attempt to differentiate it from the Phil Spector Wall of Sound version. Certainly did that. Hard to know how seriously Mike is taking his lead vocal. He's almost too straight on his delivery. He's also louder than God. Is in full nose mode. Jack Sperling, the drummer for the orchestral tracks, going to town in the back. The harmonies do some really inventive things at the end, particularly the descending thing that follows the minor scale right at the end there. Very modern. And then again, they go all Tonight Show after that. So pretty interesting / insane version of the song. Again, not sure quite how it compares to the Spector version, which is so definitive. Bruce Springsteen basically redid the Spector version of it. Later, many other cover versions of the song that are well known. The Jacksons and Mariah Carey being two other well-known versions. I don't think the Beach Boys version is going to, again, make anyone forget those classic versions, but it's unique. The earliest known recording of this song, which was written by J. Fred Coots, and Haven Gillespie, I know that name. Hold on a minute. I should have put this in my notes, but he's involved in something else that we care about. American Tin Pan Alley composer, Lucky Old Sun. Right. He was the writer of that Lucky Old Sun, which was the cornerstone of, we have lost the Beach Boys Christmas album. Wow, that sucks. Memorably covered by Brian on his album of the same name, in my opinion, Brian's finest solo album. So we have sort of another hint of things to come by a cover of a Haven Gillespie track. Where was I with talking about it? The earliest known recording was by banjoist Harry Reeser in 1934, then sung on Eddie Cantor's radio show that same year, when it became an instant hit. Next we have White Christmas, and I want to just quickly say that doing research on the song sent me into a whole Bing Crosby rabbit hole last night when I'd had a little too much cheap wine here in the Philippines. That's what one does. And wow, Bing Crosby, that's somebody I got to spend about a year listening to. What a singer. So Brian had some big shoes to fill. Brian does not croon in this. We have a kind of a high, again, back to double track, Brian's typical sound, a high double track Brian vocal with more reverb on Brian's vocals than we're accustomed to hearing for this. It's kind of a muddy vocal all around, a bit over elaborated again on the arrangement. The solo, however, where the orchestra plays, the melody is quite restrained, and although a bit slushy, it's very pretty. I think Bruce Johnston would have approved of it. This track, by the way, was not done live with the orchestra. It was overdubbed later, as I think was Brian's other lead vocal on Blue Christmas. So Brian did Blue Christmas and he did White Christmas. A coincidence? I don't know, but it's kind of interesting that happened. I want to tell a quick story about this from my own experience. Sometimes I talk about Beach Boys songs that I have done myself. That's sort of one of my entry points to this show, my experience as a musician. When I was 17 years old, there was a thing we did in my high school for charity, Christmas telegrams. And if you paid enough money, they would send you out and to sing a Christmas song to them in person. And basically, I got nominated to do this because I was the only one that had little enough shame at age 17 to go sing random songs for people in the hallways and on the street. I've often talked about how poor I was as a singer when I was 17 years old, and even when I was 27 years old, I really was a late bloomer vocally. So basically where I'm going with this is I was asked to go to the home of a woman in my small town. She was an elderly lady. She was bedridden. And I did my best version of White Christmas that I could in my best 17-year-old croaky croon, and walked away feeling very good that I'd comforted an old lady that was ill and sick in bed. And I found out later that she immediately died after I was done singing. So, like I said, I sucked. So Uh, Brian's version may not make us forget Bing Crosby's version, but it was certainly superior to mine in that nobody, as far as I know, died. White Christmas was famously written by Irving Berlin in 1940, made famous in the 1942 film Holiday Inn, first sung by Bing Crosby on live radio on Christmas 1941, just after Pearl Harbor, when the nation needed some uplifting. Irving Berlin, by the way, knew that he had written something spectacularly good. The story goes that he told his secretary after writing it that it's not just the best song I ever wrote, it's the best song anybody ever wrote. And it's hard to disagree. It is, I believe, the best-selling single in history. Bing Crosby's version alone sold 50 million copies, so many that the master was damaged and they had to re-record it in 1947, trying to do it as close to the original as they could. If you count in cover versions, it's up to 100 million copies of the song sold in history. Next we have I'll Be Home for Christmas, another song popularized by Bing Crosby, another song with a strong association with World War II. I'll Be Home for Christmas was custom crafted as a song for soldiers that were overseas fighting in 1943, which was the year it was released. It was written by Kim Gannon and Walter Kent, possibly based on an idea that they'd been exposed to by another songwriter named Buck Ram, who later was famous for working on, was it the Coasters records? I think it was the Coasters. We'll put it up there. Johnny Mathis had the best known recent version for this after Bing Crosby's. This song is a really nice intro in the beginning of the song. The vocal arrangement harkens back a bit to Bing Crosby's, the kind of close harmony things he did on some of his more Western-oriented material. By the way, Bing Crosby got no harmony love on the prior track. There were no harmonies on White Christmas, once again giving the band a break and probably helping the production schedule a little bit by not having to do vocals for that one. Brian, again, is the lead vocalist, as he is pretty much all through this album on the orchestral side, taking the solo lines. Personally, I do have a weakness for that kind of soaring, reverbed out, single note string line that takes over during the solo section. So this is probably my favorite orchestral bit on this album. There's no big surprises on the arrangement. Vocally, even though the jazz harmonies are impressive, at this point the Beach Boys were so good, I kind of think they could have done this kind of thing in their sleep. When you think back on some of the stuff that they did on All Summer Long and even on prior albums, they were really, really good at this stuff at this point. And it's no surprise to me that they were able to just chin up right there with a 41-piece orchestra that played with, I'm sure, doing Jackie Gleason sessions and Frank Sinatra and Dean Martin and people like that. I mean, I don't know if it's the exact same players, but I imagine it was. And Beach Boys were like, yeah, we got this. We close up with Auld playing Syne, which is an a cappella thing with a very earnest voiceover by Dennis, who, as I said, was absent seemingly for quite a few of the vocal sessions of this album. Giving him this little spoken word thing might have been an acknowledgement of that, just as giving Al Jardine the lead vocal on Christmas Day might have been partly because he wasn't playing on the track. I don't know, that's just a guess. But also Dennis, of course, had quite a following with the ladies, and it did kind of make sense to put him up front, speaking for the band, something that he had done on other occasions, like in the Girls on the Beach movie where he had the one speaking part. So this was a comfortable place for him to be. He takes over sounding very, very sincere and spontaneous, even repeating a word at one point. Although I have to say, he goes, if you happen to be listening to this album right now, well, Dennis, what else would we be doing? We are, in fact, listening to you. If we weren't, we wouldn't be hearing what you're saying. So a little weird there. This being a very dry vocal performance for the band, if you can get the version of the song, I think it came out in the 1998 version, where we've got Dennis's voiceover stripped away, you can hear harmonically it's a great one for analyzing what the band did because there's so little reverb on it. And the harmonies do some really interesting things. There's a very unusual and intriguing move into a minor key that's sort of hidden by what Dennis is doing. The ending is kind of a takeoff of Their Hearts Were Full of Spring, but with a lot of extra passing tones added. one wonders how they kept track of all this stuff. I don't even know, but this is a really cool little thing. Auld Lang Syne, just the history of it. It's the oldest song on this album. It was first codified as a poem in 1788 by the famous poet Robert Burns, using a traditional melody from an older Scottish folk song. It was then grafted apparently onto a different Scottish folk song to have the melody that we know now in 1799, but most of it's attributed to Robert Burns. I don't usually cover outtakes, but on this one there's some that are notable. One is The Lord's Prayer, which was a B-side to the Little Deuce Coupe single in 1963. If you think Dennis couldn't hang with the complex harmonies on that the band did, The Lord's Prayer is one of the very most complicated, difficult, and amazing arrangements that they ever did. And Craig Slinsky actually asked me to analyze it. I think it would take me all week to break down what they are doing here. It's when I listen to it, I just can't even understand how they kept track of these harmonies. They're astounding. And Dennis was there, and he's pulling off, just with the rest of the guys, some very, very difficult and intricate and almost keyless, in terms of it's being very hard to discern the home key, moves, diatonically through different places in the scale. It's just incredible singing. And you hear this, I think it was the American Family TV movie that was done about the Beach Boys, the first half of which was quite good. And there's a scene in that where they use this to sort of both show the Beach Boys how they developed singing as a family unit at holiday gatherings, and also to make the point that Dennis was a singer and he was part of it. And there's a point where Dennis goes slightly flat on the recording, and in the TV movie version you see Carl reacting to this and going like this, trying to get Dennis up, because the whole thing in the movie scene is Dennis insisting that he can do the part, that he can be part of the family vocal blend. It's a really clever use of the song, a really cool scene in a pretty flawed movie, but I loved that scene. But The Lord's Prayer, seek that out. I believe it's on the 1998 version of the album. But one of the Beach Boys' most overlooked tracks, and one of their most, it's just in a league of its own. And the fact that Brian was able to arrange this at age 21, really just jaw-dropping, amazing. Two other songs that are worth mentioning. Brian actually wrote a song for Dick Reynolds to arrange called Christmas Eve. It was really quite nice, sort of had a languid kind of Floyd Kramer kind of a vibe, kind of cocktail lounge kind of thing. They never finished it, but the bootleg of it's up on YouTube. I don't know if it was bootleg or what, but you can hear it on YouTube. Really kind of cool. They also tried Jingle Bells and couldn't find it. Don't care. Don't need to do Jingle Bells again. And yeah, that's my take on the Beach Boys Christmas album. Overall, I got to say, I think it's a bit weak relative to what came before and after. The original side, pretty tossed off. Very clear Brian was under time pressure, not taking the job real seriously, just trying to get some stuff out. But some real highlights. Love Man with All the Toys. Christmas Day, really interesting, kind of curio, and that the band is sonically not sounding a little bit more like the Replacements than we're used to hearing them, and Al singing like Brian, and sounding very interesting, hearing him step up to the mic for the first time, not really having gotten that kind of hearty Al Jardine style locked in yet, and sort of still looking for his vibe. Now, I had intended to talk about Brian's breakdown, which took place right around the release of this album, but I've decided that what I want to do is start doing some standalone episodes of this series that aren't part of the usual album review or review the Outside Productions as we do for Patreon subscribers. Getting into some subjects that come up as we go through the band's history chronologically. So I think I'm going to do a separate show about the events leading up to Brian's breakdown. It may not be as long and as elaborate as the album ones are, but that'll be coming up next. And once again, I want to remind you, if you want to see more episodes of Pet Squares, if you want to see them come out more often, do consider becoming a patron, either through Patreon or PayPal of the show. Any amount is fine. We have, you can pick what amount you want to support, even if it's $1 a month. But basically, the time I put into the show, it isn't small. because I want this to be a show that brings something new, brings new information. It's not just me reacting to songs. If you enjoy what's going on here and you want to see it come out more often, do consider becoming a patron. But otherwise, just keep watching. Thanks for having me, and we'll see you soon on the next episode of Pet Squares.